The gavel of her father's debt fell harder than any auctioneer's hammer that October morning in 1877, when Hannah Whitfield stood trembling on the porch of a Kansas farmhouse and heard the words that would haunt her for the rest of her days. Her own father had traded her hand in marriage to a stranger twice her age, in exchange for a horse. If you believe in kindness, faith, redemption, and second chances, I ask you now, before this story carries you away, to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe, so stories like this one keep finding their way to hearts that need them. The wind that morning smelled of dry hay and coming winter, and the Kansas sky stretched pale and merciless over the Whitfield farm, a plot of cracked earth that had failed to yield a decent harvest for 3 years running. Hannah's father, Otis Whitfield, was a broken man long before that day, a widower who had buried his wife 2 winters past and had since drowned his grief in whiskey and bad debts. He owed money to a rancher named Silas Grubb, a man whose reputation preceded him through every saloon and stable from Abilene to Dodge City, a man known for his cruelty to hired hands and his hunger for young wives, having already buried 2 of his own. When Otis could not pay what he owed, Grubb rode onto the farm on a spotted gray mare, looked at Hannah standing by the well with her dark hair loose in the wind, and made an offer that no father should ever accept. He would forgive the debt, and throw in a fine bay horse besides, if Otis would give him Hannah as his wife. Hannah remembered standing frozen by that well, the bucket rope cutting into her palms, as her father's eyes met hers for just a moment before sliding away in shame. She was 19 years old, an age when other girls in town were being courted properly, brought flowers, walked home from church socials under the approving eyes of their mothers. Instead, she watched her fate decided in the dust of her own yard, traded like cattle, her worth measured against the value of a horse. She wanted to scream, to run, but there was nowhere on that flat Kansas prairie to hide from a debt, and nowhere to hide from a father's desperation. That night, she lay awake in the loft of the barn, listening to the wind rattle the boards, praying to a God she was not certain was listening anymore, asking only for some way out, some door she could not yet see. The wedding was set for the following month, to take place at Grubb's ranch some 30 miles west, a stretch of land near the Smoky Hill River where he ran cattle and kept a house full of silence and old sorrow. Hannah was to be delivered there like a parcel, escorted by her father and a hired man, riding in a rickety wagon across the open plains. It was on that journey, halfway between despair and resignation, that fate intervened in the form of a quiet man on a chestnut horse, a drifter named Thomas Calloway, who had been riding the cattle trails since the war ended, a man who spoke little but whose eyes carried the weight of things seen and things lost. Thomas had ridden with the Confederate cavalry as a boy of 16, had watched friends die in fields not so different from the one he now crossed, and had come home to Missouri to find his family's farm burned and his mother buried beneath a wooden cross with no name carved into it, for there had been no time and no money for proper stone. Since then, he had wandered, taking work where he found it, breaking horses, driving cattle, saying little to anyone, for words had never come easy to him, and grief had taught him that silence was often safer than speech. He was not a man who sought out trouble, but he was a man who could not abide the sight of cruelty, and when he came upon Otis Whitfield's wagon stuck in a rutted crossing near Cottonwood Creek, he offered his help without a second thought, as was his custom. It was there, kneeling in the mud beside the wagon wheel, that he first saw Hannah's face, pale and tear-streaked though she tried to hide it, her hands folded tightly in her lap as though holding herself together by will alone. He said nothing of what he noticed, only worked the wheel free with quiet strength. But something in her eyes stayed with him as he rode on ahead, something that felt less like the sorrow of a simple journey and more like the sorrow of a woman being led to her own funeral. He made camp that night a mile down the trail, and it was there, over the crackle of a small fire, that he overheard the hired man speaking carelessly to Otis about the arrangement with Grubb, about the horse traded for the girl, about the wedding to come. Thomas sat in the darkness beyond the firelight, and something old and buried within him, some sense of justice inherited from a father who had once stood against bullies in their Missouri town, stirred awake. He did not act rashly, for he was not a reckless man, but the following morning, he found reason to ride alongside the wagon, offering to escort them through territory known for outlaws, and Otis, weary and wanting company against his own guilt, allowed it. Through the long hours of that ride, Thomas said little, but he watched and he listened, and slowly, in the careful way that trust is built between wounded souls, Hannah began to speak to him in fragments, first about the weather, then about her mother who had passed, and finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, about the terror she felt at what awaited her at the Grub Ranch. Thomas listened without judgment, and when she finished, he said only that no woman should be given away like property, that some things a man could not stand by and watch happen, even if it was not his place to interfere. It was the most he had said in a single breath in over a year, and Hannah found herself weeping quietly at the simple mercy of being heard. That night, as the wagon camped beside a stand of cottonwoods along the river, Thomas made his decision, though he told no one of it directly. He approached Otis after Hannah had gone to sleep, and spoke to him plainly, asking if the man truly believed this was what his late wife would have wanted for their daughter, asking if a horse was truly worth more than his own flesh and blood. Otis, drunk on shame and whiskey both, broke down weeping by the fire, confessing that he hated himself for what he had done, that he saw his wife's eyes in Hannah's every time she looked at him with such quiet suffering, but that he did not know how else to save the farm, how else to keep from losing everything his wife had helped him build. Thomas, moved by the raw grief in the older man's voice, offered him a proposition that would change all their lives. He had saved wages from years of hard riding, money he had intended to use to buy a small piece of land of his own, a dream he had carried since the war, of finally putting down roots and living quiet. He offered that money to Otis, enough to cover the debt to Grub twice over, on the single condition that the marriage arrangement be called off, and that Hannah be given the choice of her own future. Otis wept harder at the offer, protesting that he could not accept charity from a stranger, but Thomas, in the plainest words he had spoken in years, told him this was not charity, but simple justice, that he had seen enough of the world taken from good people by war and cruelty, and he would not stand by and let one more soul be sacrificed for the sake of a debt. By the light of the dying fire, with the Kansas stars wheeling silent overhead, Otis Whitfield agreed, and the following dawn, instead of continuing west toward the Grub Ranch, the wagon turned back east toward home, carrying with it a lightness none of them had felt in a long while. But such stories in the Old West rarely resolved so easily, and Silas Grubb was not a man to release his claim without a fight. Word reached him within days that the Whitfield girl had been withdrawn from their arrangement, and rage boiled in him hot and immediate, for he had already told half the county of his coming bride, and pride mattered to him more than most things. He rode to the Whitfield farm with 2 hired men at his side, each armed and grim-faced, and found Thomas Calloway standing on the porch, having stayed on at Otis's invitation to help repair the barn and the fences that had long fallen into disrepair. Grubb demanded either the girl or his money back with interest, his voice carrying across the yard like a threat given shape, and it was here that Thomas, a man who had spoken perhaps 50 words in the preceding week, found his voice rising steady and unafraid. He told Grubb plainly that the debt had been paid in full, that no further claim existed, and that if Grubb wished to dispute it, he was welcome to take the matter to the sheriff in town, a man named Reuben Cole, known throughout the county for his fairness and his refusal to be intimidated by wealthy ranchers. Grubb sneered at the mention of the law, for he believed his money bought him influence enough to bend most matters his way, but Thomas held his ground, standing between Grubb's fury and the farmhouse where Hannah watched through a window, her heart hammering with a fear she had not felt even on the day of her sale. It was Otis, finding a courage he had lost years before, who stepped onto the porch beside Thomas and told Grubb that his daughter would never be sold again. Not for a horse, not for any price, and that if Grubb wanted trouble, he would find that 2 men with nothing left to lose made for dangerous company. Whether it was the steel in Thomas's eyes, forged by years of war and wandering, or the unexpected backbone in a father long thought broken, Grubb's men exchanged uneasy glances, unwilling to press a fight that might cost more than pride. Grubb himself, cursing loudly, swore he would see them ruined, that he would speak to every banker and merchant in the territory. But Thomas, unmoved, replied quietly that a man who had to buy his wives with livestock had little standing to speak of ruin to anyone. The words landed like a blow, and Grubb, humiliated before his own hired men, wheeled his horse and rode off in a cloud of dust and fury, though the threat of his influence lingered over the Whitfield farm like a storm cloud that had not yet broken. In the weeks that followed, life on the farm began, slowly and carefully, to mend. Thomas stayed on, first out of a sense of duty to see the family safely past Grub's reach, and then, as autumn deepened into winter, for reasons that had far more to do with the quiet strength he saw growing in Hannah each day than any remaining obligation. She had begun to laugh again, tentative at first, like a bird testing wings after a long confinement, and Thomas found himself listening for that laugh across the fields, finding excuses to work near the house, to share the evening meal, to sit by the fire long after Otis had gone to bed, speaking in the soft, unhurried way that two wounded people speak when they are learning, together, how to trust again. He told her, over many quiet evenings, of his childhood in Missouri, of the mother he had lost, of the brothers who had not returned from the war, and of the long, lonely years of riding trails that led nowhere in particular because he had nowhere in particular to belong to. She told him of her own mother's gentle hands, of the hymns they used to sing together while churning butter, of the dreams she had once held of a home filled with children's laughter before her father's debts had nearly stolen every dream she possessed. In each other's grief, they found an unexpected mirror, and in each other's kindness, they found the first real hope either had known in years. Winter came hard that year, burying the Kansas plains under drifts of snow that made travel nearly impossible, and it was during the worst of that season that Grub made one final, desperate attempt at revenge, riding out under cover of a blinding snowstorm with the intent of burning the Whitfield barn to the ground in retaliation for his humiliation. Thomas, unable to sleep, heard the crunch of hooves in the snow before Grub's men could complete their wicked plan, and rushed out into the storm to confront them. A struggle unfolding in the darkness and swirling snow that left him bloodied and bruised but victorious, having driven off the arsonists before real harm could be done. Sheriff Cole arrived the following morning, summoned by a neighboring farmer who had seen riders fleeing in the night, and upon hearing the full account of Grub's repeated harassment, rode out himself to deliver a stern warning that any further trouble would see Grub answering to a judge in Topeka. Whether from fear of the law or simple exhaustion of his vendetta, Grub's threats finally ceased, and the Whitfield farm knew peace at last. It was in the early days of spring, as the Kansas prairie began to green again and the first calves were born in the pasture, that Thomas finally found the courage to speak the words he had carried silently through the long winter months. He asked Hannah to walk with him along the creek where they had first truly spoken all those months before, and there, beneath a cottonwood tree just beginning to bud, he told her that he did not have much to offer, no grand ranch, no fortune, only a strong back and an honest heart, but that he had come to love her not as a debt to be settled or a promise to be kept, but as the woman who had taught him, without ever meaning to, that a heart broken by war and loss could still learn to hope again. Hannah, with tears streaming freely down her face for the first time in joy rather than sorrow, told him that she had been sold once for the price of a horse, but that this time she was choosing, freely and with her whole heart, to give herself to a man who had asked for nothing in return but the chance to love her honestly. They were married that summer in the small white church in town, with Otis walking his daughter down the aisle with tears of a different kind than those he had shed the year before, tears of pride and gratitude for a second chance he had never believed he deserved. Sheriff Cole stood among the witnesses, and even some of Grub's former hired men, having quietly abandoned his employ after witnessing his cruelty, came to see the wedding of the girl who had once been nearly sold like livestock, now radiant in a simple white dress sewn by the women of the church community who had taken her into their hearts. Thomas used what remained of his savings, along with a small loan from the bank that Sheriff Cole himself helped arrange, to purchase a modest plot of land adjoining the Whitfield farm, and there he and Hannah built a life together, a small but sturdy cabin, a growing herd of cattle, and in time, children whose laughter filled the prairie air with a sound that Hannah had once feared she would never hear in her own home. Otis lived to see his grandchildren grow, and in his final years, he often told the story of the daughter he had nearly lost to his own weakness, and the silent cowboy whose quiet courage had saved them both. A story he shared as a warning against desperation and a testament to the possibility of redemption, no matter how deep a man's failures might run. Hannah herself, in later years, would tell her own children that the Lord often sends help in the most unexpected forms, sometimes not as thunder or lightning, but as a quiet stranger on a chestnut horse who simply refuses to look away from suffering when he has the power to ease it. Now, before we come to the end of this story, I want to ask you something. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight, and share with me the lesson this story left in your heart. For stories like Hannah's are not simply tales of the past, but reminders for how we might live today with courage, with kindness, and with the willingness to stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. If this story of a broken girl and a silent cowboy touched something within you, if you believe that love and courage can redeem even the darkest circumstances, I ask you once more to like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, share it with someone who needs a reminder that second chances are real, and subscribe so that more stories of faith, hope, and redemption from the American frontier can find their way into your life. Hannah Whitfield, once valued at the price of a single horse, became instead a woman whose worth could never be measured, and whose story reminds us all that sometimes, the quietest hearts carry the loudest courage, and that even in the harshest corners of the Old West, kindness could still change everything.